Before I go mad and sort out the prism, I might as well sort out the front of the shutter, the control rings, because otherwise we won't be able to see much through the prism anyway without the lens mounted correctly. So these pieces, I'm fairly convinced that this camera has done very little work. It probably sat around idle for many years. I think the residual problems with the shutter, once I'd corrected the front control rings here that had been put back incorrectly. So I think the original problem with the shutter was that the shutter just needed to be serviced, and that was just a factor of the fact that the camera has sat around for 5 or 6 decades doing not very much at all. And it wouldn't have mattered. Had it been exercised, it probably wouldn't have made much difference, not over that length of time. But I think in essence the camera's never done much work. The problem with the meter and the difficulty with the meter setting, that still puzzles me slightly. I suppose it's possible that that pushed in meter window was the cause of the difficulty there, but I won't know until I get that meter back on there, get that window correctly placed, that that's the only problem. It's fairly important that these control rings all be quite clean. Being exposed at the front of the camera, they're prone to getting dust and dirt in them, and that just stops things from revolving as smoothly as they should do. This piece is the piece that opens the aperture of your lens to the viewing, fully for viewing. And if that's sticky, it won't move correctly. If it won't move correctly, the shutter won't work correctly. Just looking at the state of this stuff, that looks pretty good. So this is our aperture control. It's our apertures. To hook that spring over that tiny hook there. Stretch it out and then get this tab dropped back into its slot. That's moving quite smoothly. Normally I'll put a little bit of graphite powder and work it in to that ring and then blow all the excess out. I don't want anything sticky going in there. It makes the settings too stiff. I'll just go and blow this out. This brass component, normally I give that a very sparing wipe of molybdenum paste on top and bottom, outside and inside surfaces, and that's it. Right, so there's a notch in here. You use you run it over that pinion. It's quite a neat fit. If it doesn't go on square, it doesn't go on. Right, that's on. And it's moving smoothly. This piece I'll wipe with molybdenum paste, but I'm just rubbing that lightly with a cotton bud to take off any excess. I don't want much on there at all. Okay, so we're just about ready to put this onto the camera. This piece is our shutter speed settings ring. If I pull that down to the bottom, that's the B position. Got to get our meter coupling in now. Make sure my meter thing is pointing to the front. That thing there is pointing to the front. That's where B should be, F1.9 ASA 10. Putting some molybdenum paste on the post of this thing. Drop it down and rotate it until it will click into place. Yep, just dropped into place. This little pinion drops over that shaft, drops into place. That little half shaft that comes out locks into this front plate. Okay, that's looking good. My meter connection is where I want it to be. The shutter speed setting plate here, this area, that notch is where it couples. This area here next to it needs to be wiped with molybdenum paste too. That's where it decouples when you go past the B position. That's where that decouples, so that needs to be lubricated. So there it is, that's all set at B. My ring here, zoom you in a bit. This notch, this edge of this track needs to be right up next to that notch like that. This is the piece that couples to our lens. It should be right up there, just about at the top of the track, but no more. Now I've got to lift this up and get it onto the camera without disturbing anything. We're off to a flying start. It's at B and F1.9. If I can get this coupled, we're in business. Let's give that a bit of an extra wriggle. We're in. Okay, so that's all in. That's coupled. That should be correct. I've got my 3 tiny chrome plated screws. I'll get those in position. Lock those 3 screws down snug. If you make a mess of one of those 3 screws, and it's not hard to do, make sure you put your ugly screw at the top and then put a blob of red paint on it when you're done. It'll look like it was always meant to be there. I can see I've moved slightly because my meter is just very slightly off the neutral position there. So I'm going to redo that. My aperture scale is off about half a stop from where that meter should have been, cable should have been sitting. I'd get away with that, but I want to get it spot on, not near enough. If it's much more off than that, then you run the risk of running to the end of the meter cord at one end or other of your travel, and then the cord snaps, and then you have to say a lot of rude words. Right, let's have this off again. Do this properly. Get that meter drum where I want it to be, right there. That notch pointing to the front. My shutter speed setting ring on there. That's sitting on there. This is all timed correctly. Hold the camera up. Put that in position. Everything's looking fairly good. Give that a wriggle. It's not quite seated. Now it is. Where are we? BF 1.9. That's at the front. We're in business. Okay. Much better to have things correctly placed than half a stop out. Otherwise people think you're clumsy. But as I was saying, if you make a mess of one of these 3 screws, just put the ugly one here, cover it with a blob of red paint, and it becomes an auxiliary alignment mark. People think you've done it to do them a favour. Let's see if all these controls move smoothly. It seems to move right through from one end of the scale to the other. No, it doesn't want to go all the way to F22 there. Something's not right. I'm half a stop out somewhere. It's a bit reluctant to move to the F22 position at either end of that scale. It sort of drops back. Got to think about that. What's going on? It's not the meter that's the problem. There's bounce, there's some bounce. I wonder if it's the spring tension on the meter cord. I think it's bouncing on that. See if I can feel anything. Yeah, you take it round to the F22 mark and it sort of drops back a bit. I'm Not sure whether that's a problem or not yet. That all counter-rotates okay. Yeah, once I get to that end of the range, it doesn't want to go. There's something odd about the way I've got these two rings arranged. Have to have them off and deal with it. Go back where we were. I'll just have these off, check my alignment. Something's very subtly off there. We know someone had these on in the wrong position. I'm going to check very carefully this gear on that rack. Make sure there's not a tooth that's got some bump in it. Make sure there's nothing impacted in these teeth. There's a little bit of dirt there. Yeah, that might have been it. There's a little bit of impacted dirt there. I'm going to have to clean that out. That's unusual. It might have just been dried grease actually impacted in there. Let's have that pinion out and clean that while I'm at it. Yeah, I've got those top rings back in place. Everything's working smoothly. Counter rotates nicely. That all appears to be good. Put the stud back in the top there that supports the top of the camera. I think I can put the original camera base plate back on at this stage too. But first, I better clean it up. Well, that certainly took longer than I expected to clean that up. There were at least 2 layers of glue there, possibly 3, but certainly 2. One of them was something a little bit unusual, and it was almost clear and crystalline. Didn't dissolve particularly well, but it did go. So we'll put this base plate back on the camera. I won't be able to fit the leatherettes yet because I'll need to get the prism fitted, and once the prism's fitted I may need to adjust the reflex mirror rest position so that the image in the finder and the image at the film plane are in agreement, and that adjustment is done here at the base plate. So the leatherette on the base plate is pretty much one of the last things to go on. Let's get that to pop back into place. Here is our base plate, which Check that the frame count is clicked into position. Get these screws back in place. The Retina Reflex IV was unusual in the Retina range of reflexes in that it was a bit short on chrome in some place, one place in particular, round here. This piece here on the front of the camera, on the Reflex 4, that was black painted. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but it's not as durable as chrome. And so as a result, it's normal to see a fair bit of wear on that black paint. Now there's no obvious wear on the black paint on this camera, which suggests to me that the camera, that's another thing that suggests to me that the camera had done little or no work. It's probably sat idle for an extended time. Now I've got to be careful with these screws because I don't want to accidentally put one of the chrome plated ones here in the base plate to be covered up with leatherette later and leave me only with a nickel plated one to go in the top cover. Chrome plated and nickel plated screws are not always the easiest to distinguish, not when the nickel plated screws are clean and undamaged anyway. Let me find my chrome plated screws. I should have two. I want one more nickel plated one. Well, that's chrome plated. That one's chrome plated. This is nickel plated. No, it's not. The chrome plated screws in this case are a bit dull. The nickel plated screws are perhaps a little bit bright. That's fine. Given where the chrome plated screws go in a Reflex 4, it wouldn't be the end of the world if we had nickel plated screws down there because they're tucked down deep in the well around the rewind knob and you can't really see them. You certainly wouldn't notice that they weren't chrome plated unless you looked very carefully and you knew what to look for. Okay. That's our base plate back on. Our front rings are in place. Really, I need to look at that prism now and see what sort of a state it's in, see how much cleaning up needs done. Now the prism assembly, the finder assembly in a Reflex 4 is quite different from that in a Reflex 3. No, you wouldn't be expecting that. Well, I've had time to have a look at this finder now. The screen is actually quite clear. The little speck of dust on there, was nothing to speak of. The problem with the prism, I don't think you can see it there, but there's a pattern of lines runs down the middle of the prism as I look into it from this distance, and that will be a loss of silver somewhere along this ridge line, either side. It's not right on the centre, it's probably either side of the centre, and I've got to decide whether that's going to be a serious issue. I think it's far enough away from the focal point that it won't be an issue. So what I'm going to do is fit the prism back on the camera, fit a lens, and see what the image quality is like. If it is not exceptionally obtrusive and it doesn't look offensive when you look in the finder, then I'll leave it well alone. The only alternative is to replace the prism. Well, at the moment I'm waiting for prisms to arrive from Germany, and they've been in transit since about October, so it's anyone's guess. Well, we're in January now, it's anyone's guess when I'm going to see them. All through this pestilence, time of pestilence, transit times have been all over the place, but anything and everything that's been sent has arrived eventually. It's just taken ridiculous lengths of time. I'll get this on the camera, I'll see what sort of a result I get and make a decision about how to go forward from there. Well, that was very informative. I tried that prism on the camera. The image is good. There is a shadow above centre. It's not particularly obtrusive, but that is what is that silvering problem is showing. I don't think it's worth putting a new prism in, given that I don't know how long I'm going to have to be waiting for more prisms to arrive anyway. And of course I never really know until I've got the prisms in my hand whether the new old stock prisms I've purchased are good, bad or indifferent. So with that being said, I'm going to leave that prism in there. I think that's going to be quite adequate. And I'm trying to clean up these leatherettes. Now the leatherettes for the front of the camera, they were no problem. They were the original adhesive that had been used when the camera was assembled. No one had been in the camera there since, and the leatherettes just cleaned up beautifully. They were no problem. I just had to scrape those lightly with the back of with the scalpel blade, and they were good. This one, the base, this is different. Something odd's being used here. I had trouble getting that adhesive off the base plate of the camera. Well, I was able to use that Lectra clean stuff, which is quite an enthusiastic solvent. But what you can do on chrome plated brass is not the same as what you can do on leatherette. So here I've got to scrape this rubbish off. I'm sort of shaving it off, you know. I'm using the sharp edge of the blade to shave this rubbish off the leatherette. Well, that's a bit fraught. I mean, one slip and you go from shaving rubbish off the surface of the leatherette to, whoops, the scalpel blade's poking out the other side. So this is tedious, and I'm just going to have to work at this until I get it all cleaned off. I think I will be able to get it all cleaned off, but yeah, this is a bit, it's unpleasant, and this stuff's sticky too, so I don't know whether it was even a water-based product. I don't think so, but it's not nice to deal with. But I've got to get all this crap off the leatherette. And shaving it down with the scalpel appears to be the only way I can achieve this. There's a limited amount I can do in the way of applying solvent to the leatherette. Even applying naphtha, you can do it. you can apply it to that inside, this is the underside of course, and as long as you don't soak the thing up completely, it can be useful sometimes to soften some other old adhesive, if it softens easily, and you can get it off the leatherette. But I wouldn't want to saturate the leatherette with naphtha, and I certainly wouldn't want to use anything more elaborate than that. Someone asked about isopropyl alcohol. Now I don't remember when that, but I know that methylated spirits, which is what denatured alcohol for some of you, that is not good on leatherettes. So isopropyl is probably less aggressive than that, but there wouldn't be much in it. I certainly wouldn't be using it. I need to get this glue off because some of it is quite lumpy. I would like the leatherettes to sit down flush, which means that they've got to be smooth. I've got to get all these lumps and bumps off. So there's no point you watching this. There'll be another 10 minutes of this. It's like watching paint dry. Back later.